about the title. I feel like there was some good thought there, flying with the nest. Or should we talk about that after at the end once we've discussed the films?
Completely up to you. I mean, I'm fine with. I mean, I think the the way the title came up might be a bit of a in this, or yeah, it might need the context of the explain the program. So yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so we'll just kind of go through chronologically and how the films were presented in this group screening. So let's start out talking about Wham Pass Intact by Kelechi Aguncha, excuse me. So the reason why we kind of or the reason why I kind of liked all four of these films together was because they all speak to this idea of revolution in really strong ways, while also addressing ideas of the archive and how one relates to the archive. So with Wham Pass Intact, we're kind of provided this really embodied experience of these two individuals engaging in capoeira practices. And of course, kind of the background on capoeira is the fact that it was a fighting methodology and ideology that was kind of started in Brazil by African peoples who were enslaved. So Kelechi in their practice is really interested in taking on the archive of various practices like capoeira, like I'm trying to think what the other films were. There was some, what's it called? Taka, when you're cosplay practices. So these are very performative moments with very specific cultures associated. And Kelechi is interested in peopling and bringing attention to Black bodies in these spaces. I believe in their artist statement, this is actually mentioned as a reinterpretation of these spaces and of these practices. So going back to my statement about these pieces all relating to the archive and also revolution, we have this very fantastic embodied fighting style that was designed and built and also hidden as a dance practice so that these enslaved peoples could practice it without being caught, without being stopped. And within this piece that we have present in the screening tonight, Wham Pass Intact, there's this really fantastic sound design that runs through the course of the piece. And we have a lot of moments where there's intervention in the soundscape of this piece where impacts double and redouble or echo. And one of the things that I was really drawn to in this piece in particular was the fact that this relationship of sound and image reminds us repeatedly of how incredibly physical sound is, and also how really intimate, the fact that we have this physical rebounding of two objects that create sound waves and that move them toward us for us to receive, was really kind of a beautiful moment where I was able to think of sound as something much more intimate than I normally do. Another element of this film that is an intervention is the use of blue screen and also these fantastic full body blue suits that allow us potentially to recontextualize who the bodies are that are engaging in this practice. Of course, blue screen is something that can be used to erase or to image composite different elements together in video practice. And here, blue is introduced very early on in the piece, and then it's reminded for us. We are re-engaging it repeatedly throughout the piece in the moments where there are light flares present. And we have these fantastic electric blue moments. And then, of course, the piece ends with these two individuals fully suited up, except for hair, which is able to move in a very dramatic fashion. And then there's also a wonderful moment of unmasking when that blue is taken down and we're able to see the faces of the performers or of the fighters, which of course carries much more contextual weight now that we've just lived through a pandemic. That practice of unmasking, or even just talking about unmasking, carries very different weight at this point. Taka, what were your thoughts about this piece? Or did you have anything you wanted to say in response to what I just gave?
Well, I think for me, like, it kind of becomes, I mean, for me, like, I kind of see the entire program as one collective unit or a really large metaphor. So I'm not sure if it makes sense for you to go through the entire program, then I can sort of add on to your
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Yeah, we can do that. So going back to my idea of these pieces being bound by archive and also revolution, this piece is entering into archive through embodied practice, through embodied performance and remembrance. And we then move into the film inauguration, which kind of anachronistically pulls moments surrounding this unsuccessful assassination that occurred in 1910. And here we see embodied remembrance kind of pitted against or informing the actual physical documents that remain from this event, and as ways to remember this event that didn't happen. Within their artist statement, the artist speaks about the erasure of remembrance and also what one chooses to forget or wants to forget. So within this piece, we have this really strong kind of formal element of the two screens that are next to each other. And we have a doubling and a redoubling repeatedly throughout the course of the film. This doubling sometimes serves to show us what is the formal or the documented history. So we see images of printed forms, printed papers. We also see sites, and those sites are kind of allowed to live and to give remembrance to themselves rather than to function as something that is interpreted for us. We also have moments where there are more experimental and intuitive moments where water or other elements serve as imagery in those rectangles for us. I really love how this film inauguration opens with this palimpsest of a space that carries great import for this story. We have moments where the image is shot through glass, and we actually have a literal layering of events within this, modern day version of a site that is important to this story about George Fung. In the middle of this piece, we have a moment where text predominates the screen. And this is a moment where I believe George's words are actually present for us. Taka, correct me if I'm wrong. But this is a moment where the statement of this young individual who attempts to assassinate a prince in order to instantiate a government that they can believe in, these words double in the same way that the images kind of did for us. And we have a moment where we have a line like, "I was afraid to shoot because there were too many Americans in the way. And of course, here we have a moment where George is actually talking about an act of violence, but that word shoot kind of doubles and redoubles and stands also for the artist Peng asking, was I afraid to shoot? How do I relate to this imagery? So we have this duplicity of meaning present in this statement as it kind of rings out across the decades for us. I found it interesting, and Taka, you may be picking up on this. I'm interested to see what you have to say about this transition into the next film, Time to Leave. But as we exited the film inauguration, there's more of an insistence on this separation or duplicity between documented official history and oral family history about this event. And the theme of forgetting history, or what does one want to forget, or what does one erase, that offered an interesting way in my mind for us to enter this film, Time to Leave, by Lewuga Benson. Of course, this is an archival film where the document doesn't necessarily reign supreme, but it does predominate the image. And here, of course, the artist is engaging in quite a few different ways of subverting, recontextualizing the image. So we've kind of moved from Wampas Intact, where we have this really embodied way of engaging history and writing history anew, or writing futures anew. We've moved into considerations of the document and of oral history with inauguration, and then we're moving into Time to Leave, where the spoken word susurrates very strongly and violently against what is seen. And the artist consistently juxtaposes images and contemporary sound bites in very anachronistic and powerful ways. One of the most jarring, perhaps, is the first time that we hear a supposed altercation mentioned at a Starbucks. Up until that point, everything had been purely archival. So to have that anachronistic moment really rings strongly as one considers the fact that not very much has changed since these archival images have been taken. We also have a lot of found sound in listening to this piece multiple times over, but specifically tonight. The sound clip from Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit really rang out as words like blood on the leaves, blood at the roots, kind of echoes underneath these images of white individuals saying where they think Black bodies should be, and also how they feel about integration in these moments. For me, Time to Leave offers this moment of rupture within the program that we've been building to with the previous films, Wampas Intact, Inauguration, and now there's an ultimate rift or breaking point where cultures have realized that they can no longer continue in this way. And in the course of the program, we then move into the film New Era, which offers some echoes from Wampas Intact. We have use of the color green in the background. So again, there's a nod to a green screen or an image that could be composited or that could hold opportunity beyond what is on the screen. And of course, the main structure or thrust of this piece is reflections on John Perry Barlow's statement about independence of cyberspace. So within this piece, the main consideration is a looking back on a document that was, in order to construct a new regime or a new space where all individuals will be able to live in equity, not in inequity, but in equity with each other. The statement that rang out for me in the reviewing of this piece, and I'm going to say it in English here, but was, "You of the past, leave us alone." And in a piece that has dealt with restructuring and repurposing archive to such an extent, this was a really interesting moment because I think it questions what can we repurpose and what must be left alone, what should be forgotten, and what needs to be remembered. So that for me was a really powerful, productive line from this piece that perhaps Taka will want to speak to more as he engages the program now. So Taka, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think like in terms of the programming that we've put together this spring season, I'm gonna move the mic a little closer. I think I mean, this is the one that's maybe the most direct in terms of address, or in your face in terms of address. But I think in a weird way, it's also one of the more complex programs, mostly because there are so many layers beyond what's on the surface level of the imagery or the direct address. And I think the way that Janelle talked about the archive and the sort of like the layering. I think in that way, I think that's also true in the sense that the way that I sort of interpreted it is a form of rehearsal. And I think, you know, as the program moves forward, I think we start to go into some really dark forms of the sense in the enactment of rehearsal. And I think with the opening piece, When Past Intact by Kalechi Aguncha, you know, we're watching the progression from the first iteration or the first sort of practice run to the second practice run. And I think the the most powerful moment is in an edit around like the 7-minute point. So it's towards the end when we go from the figures practicing at night in their regular clothing, and almost seamlessly through the framing, we cut to them in the blue full body suits. And you know, I think that is sort of like the overarching metaphor or the theme of this program, is the notion of rehearsing and rehearsing and rehearsing through these iterations, whether it's through policy, whether it's through violence, whether it's through what have you, to reach this new sort of iteration, this new form of existence, or maybe a new society. So it opens up with that film, and then we go into to Peng Zhuxiang's inauguration, where I think the most interesting line in there is the difference in the rehearsal of an oral history versus actual history, because we hear in the conversation between the maker and the relative, how in his family they were always told a certain, like, oh, he wasn't born here, or he was always born there, and then the actual documents say otherwise. So in that way, it's the idea of trying to strip someone of a certain identity because it's it's more convenient in the telling of, or in the progression of time to sort of go with that route. So let's try this telling of history, or rehearse this telling of history to see how this goes in the long run or towards future generations. And I think in that one too, one of the first lines that we see, which is sort of that why it becomes a bit of a direct address, is that the whole reason for the assassination attempt was to try to bring about a new society. So in that way, it becomes this rehearsal of trying to create or try to build a better society, or maybe a more, as Janelle said, an equitable society through violence, through the removal of a political leader or royalty. And I think, as we move through the program, we get more and more entrenched into not just violence against one individual, but systemic violence and larger and more deeply rooted systems of oppression, and Luuga Benson's Time to Leave. And in that one, the rehearsal becomes not one act, but multiple forms of large scale, whether it's by the government or whether it's by a race or a certain group of people, a multi-year reiteration of trying to implement this form of society. And I think the most powerful, I think, moment comes when it riffs back to the previous film, where we hear someone retelling their encounter of trying to deposit their first check at a bank, and the emotional impact that has, and retelling that story, or having to sort of recall that moment and bring that actual event to sort of that rehearsal space of retelling history, or resurfacing that history. So that becomes a really powerful moment when we hear him at the very end say, that happened so long ago, but I don't like talking about it. And the I think the sort of dual, and this is again where it sort of uh, pulls from the previous film, where where Inauguration had the two-channel sort of side-by-side images. I think in this one, with Time to Leave, the sort of dual meaning behind that is sort of the implication or the intent of the bank teller saying it's time to leave, from a white perspective, versus the notion of, I think, the idea of, time to leave from the Black perspective, and the idea of, thinking about the notion of Afrofuturism, and the idea of the future generations being present, or always having been there. So it's the notion of having, empowering the self and leaving for that other dimension. And I think also, I think the sort of darkness of this piece, I think comes, I mean, it was intentional in the curation of it, was that this piece felt right to put in our May program, being the 1 year, of the month of the killing of George Floyd. And we see George Floyd in the image, along with Tamir Rice and Michael Brown. And it feels like this this really like it's tough to speak about in the sense of not wanting to turn those three individuals that are on the screen as sort of and this is where the term rehearsal really takes a really dark turn. Is that's sort of the white supremacist rehearsal of, oh, let's try removing these figures from society, and I think that's where this idea of dueling notions of trying out these systems of living become really dark in this piece. And I think also it's where the complexity of the program also lies is in extending that out of this piece and into the larger society. And the notion of rehearsal is also the fact that this is also around the time when we knew the Chauvin verdict was going to come out, and it's the idea of, okay, is this another rehearsal of how what we're going to try out for future society, and how to handle these. So it really becomes a difficult piece, and I think coming out of that, and I mentioned the notion of this Afrofuturism, and I think that's where moving into new era felt appropriate, because I think this touches on that notion of a space that of the future, that they're coming back from and to communicating with figures from the past that are actually the present, where we are, or at least the present when that speech was made. And I think there, it with the green screen, with the space imagery, and with the notion of a sort of liberated utopia space almost, I think that's sort of the ultimate goal of this space where we no longer are in this archive, or like digging through archives of the either traumatic history or violence, and moving to a state where it none of that really exists or matters. And the quote that says, governments derive their just powers from consent of the governed, that sort of um, made me think, and I was reading this. That I won't hold the book up, but it's a book
What
called
does it say?
The Democratic Paradox by Chantal Mouffe, and in that book, she mentions that the idea of liberal democracy as a societal construct that's the idea of liberal and democracy together. That's the paradox of that, is that while the ideal of a liberal democracy is that everyone is given power, or everyone is given a voice, um, the as long as a government exists in this form of a liberal democracy, government can only function if they have someone or some entity to control. In that sense, that sort of made me think about that line, and why we are in the state that we are now. Made me think of that book. And for her, she also references two modes of working, because we aren't really going to escape out of this paradox. Is you have these two forms of antagonistic pluralism and agonistic pluralism. And for her, antagonistic pluralism is where we sort of are, where we pit enemies against each other, where um, you have two sides battling, and they don't see the other side as an equal. It's someone that they have to defeat, and that's sort of where we are right now. And agonistic pluralism is one where you have two sides, but they're adversaries. So they're all fighting for the same cause. So that's sort of the ideal, is this notion of agonistic pluralism. So that's that piece. And the closing piece sort of made me think a little bit more about that book and this idea of, I guess, opening it up to a space where what can we as a society do to sort of end this idea of rehearsing violence, rehearsing oppression. And while I don't, this notion of a cyberspace doesn't really exist, the metaphor of that does. And that's sort of where this whole program came together, is this notion of rehearsals for me.
Yeah. And even against our best efforts, because we tend not to be we tend not to try to put together programs that speak to each other. But this year in particular, it just feels like it's been an omnibus that has spoken. So bringing in Afrofuturism speaks to several of our previous programs that have touched on some of those themes. So it feels like aCinema's 2020-2021 year is coming full circle in some of the themes that Taka, you were bringing forward. I was interested in this idea of the agonistic and the antagonistic, and the way that that relates to larger government structures. Because I was recently reading an article about superviolence, and the fact that with drone technology, it would be very easy to unleash deaths in the thousands very, very quickly. And that article and this notion of superviolence questions what the role of government is, because that article said, oh, government is to protect. So what happens if they're no longer able to protect? And I just think that's an interesting statement in the larger context of what's been going on, because whom does a government protect? Whom are you protecting from? And very obviously, in the pieces that we have put together, in some ways, the government is the aggressor to a very large extent, or those individuals are. So I'm just fascinated by this question of what a government does, and how they function in relation to the governed.
I just want to say that this has been a remarkable series. This season has just been fantastic, and I don't even know if it's possible, but if it's possible, I really want to go back and watch. I want to start at the beginning of the season and like watch the whole thing and see how it progressed, because
like a marathon of it. Yeah,
because it's fascinating to me that this is where we're ending up the conversation here, talking about like what is government, like that seed, I think, it was there all the while, but I feel like it's exactly appropriate to that being the sort of like ultimate question of this season. And I'm not saying, actually, I don't even want to say it is the ultimate question, but how do we assess everything that has been happening with the received ideas we have about government? How do we understand? I don't think I certainly don't think I see government in the same way right now than I probably did a year ago. But I could have if I think I could have had some of the insights I feel like I might have now earlier. But anyway, I just want to, I want to watch it all again.
Yeah, we can certainly try to make that possible through like a playlist. I think we have enough podcasts there that we can privately try to put it together and put a playlist together. But
I'm
I
just
think,
thinking how long that would be. It would be doable.
Well, totally. Yeah.
yeah, but
It would be
Laura,
doable.
I think thinking about your question about what does government even mean, I mean that might be a good time to bring in the title of this program and sort of decoding that. And I think for us, and this ties in back to even the first program with Anouks and thinking about the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene is the moment in which humanity realizes its own fragility. I think that's sort of where this title came from, and the idea of what, maybe not what does government even mean, but what does human mean? And I think there's this quote out of this Zen book that says, Dogen Zenji says to be like a boatman. Although he is carried by the boat, he is also handling the boat. That is how we live in this world. Even though you understand how to live in this world like a boatman, that does not mean you're able to do it. It is very difficult. So I think in that way, I, I I understand the sentiment of that quote, but I also think that I like to break that apart and think about the first word, which is boatman. Thinking in that sense that we are now removing or reclassifying ourselves aside from a universal notion of being human to these certain titles, occupations, gender, race, and I think that's sort of I think all of that that first word boatman, and the notion of you are this, so you also have to operate this, or you have to operate under this this structure, this system, and that's what we at a certain point understand, but I think and that's what makes it really difficult. And I think that also brings to mind a quote by James Baldwin, where he's addressing, I believe it's Cambridge, where he's addressing the early like American Western films of I can't remember the actor's name now, um, but it's the notion of the cowboy shooting the Indians, and as a Black individual at the age of 6 or 7, you've been rooting for this American cowboy this whole time, but then at a certain point you realize that the Indians are you. So it's that notion of realizing that this burden or this weight that you can't really escape from, but you have to navigate through. That's sort of where the title of Flying with the Nest comes from, is this idea of as a bird you construct this home, this structure, but in the larger context of the earth, having to then fly or carry it with you the whole time. And there are some birds that reuse the same nest. So it's again going through retellings and the archives and history repeating itself. The notion of this generational weight that you have to carry. That's sort of where the title comes from. And I think on another level, and this might be more of a happier or maybe a brighter reading of, or lineage of where the title comes from, at least for me. I wanted to have the title include some reference to a bird, mostly because right now on my back patio, right by the lamp shade, there's actually a bird's nest, and I believe it's a Carolina wren, but it's this really elaborate nest. And I mean, right now I have all these potted plants that I'm having to shuttle in and out of the house, mostly because the mornings are still a little too cold. So I've been doing that, and in a weird way, it's become this relationship where I've sort of seen the bird fly in and out, and there's one of the two parent birds that's totally fine with me being there. So they've accepted me as not being a threat. So they fly into the nest, out of the nest, stay in the nest. And I think in that sense, trying to build this relationship where I remove my sense of being a human or being this imminent threat to building this collaboration, this sort of unified relationship with this bird and their nest, and trying to protect and also look out for this structure and this well-being of that new family. I think that in a sense goes back to the idea from the Anthropocene, and the moment where I think where it's not really an idea of humanity realizing its own fragility, but humanity removing its sense of superiority, maybe, and sort of understanding our place in the larger world, and how maybe, and I think an alternate title that we threw out there was the bird sings more than it knows, which is this idea of, I mean, some thinking about, I mean, now we're studying and through observing animals, how we sometimes pick up on animal communications and how that can actually signal something larger. So in that sense, I think it's kind of a way to say, like, we kind of try to decode and learn from the animal kingdom and translate it, but sometimes it's the idea of, yeah, they already knew that. So when they're singing and when they're communicating, maybe they're speaking more than they know, but they being us as humans.
Taka, I feel like you and I talk about what animals and specifically plants know and what they teach us a lot. And as you were speaking about decolonized and in some ways post-human relations to the earth, I was just hearing these absolutely backward statements from Lewuga Benson's Time to Leave of these white individuals. And then the statements that are made toward the end of the film about don't patronize us, don't patronize us. If you're afraid that we'll be better than you, just say that. So I was really thinking about how racism and systemic racism is rooted in an idea of lack, of there not being enough resources, of there not being enough space, and also how that relates to this construct of superiority in how one does relate to animals. I was just wondering what would happen if those statements from Lewuga's film were superimposed or expanded to engage some of the things that you were talking about just now. And I think, intentionally or not, that was just a very large theme that grew out of this season, was the connection of ethical relation to other human beings, and also ethical relation to the environment and to the non-human.
I want to point out something interesting that you said, Taka. You said a lot of interesting things, but and now I might actually ask you to repeat it if you can. The quote about the boatman. Could you repeat that so I don't mar it?
It's Dogen Zenji says to be like a boatman. Although he is carried by the boat, he is also handling the boat. That is how we live in this world. Even though you understand how to live in this world like a boatman, that does not mean you are able to do it. It is very difficult. And then there's the connection after that is which is why you practice Zazen or practice the Zen practice. But
So what's so crazy to me about that quote, what's interesting, like that the boat is a thing a human being makes like it's not a natural, it's not something out there in the world. And I know you were talking about it in terms of like identities that we put on ourselves, which we also create. But I just think that that's so fascinating to like call oneself a boatman. It's like calling oneself a human or in a weird way too, because it's like that's what humans create, these things, and then we have them, and like we're like we're inside them, we're inside the bed we made, we're inside the boat we made, and like we carry the boat with us and we fly with the nest and all of these things. It's a really strange thing to think about what it means, what the boat could mean, in a wider metaphorical sense, that in a metonymic sense or something, that it could be any kind of technology, um, any kind of structure, any government, anything that humans make with one another. Um,
yeah, and I think that quote is sort of a mark that shows, I think, the maybe fatal flaw in the Blue Lives Matter retort to Black Lives Matter, in the sense that, I mean, there's one in the sense that, you know, you you are the boatman, you operate, but you also, you know, it's a very difficult relationship. I mean, that's sort of the notion of the Black life, where the fatal flaw in the blue life is, I mean, the that's that's where the argument's been stated over and over and over again, is that's a profession. You can
yeah,
easily leave
yeah,
that and stop operating as that.
mhm. Yeah, yeah.
And Taka, when we were discussing various titles and various iterations of this language, um, one of the conversations that came up for us was, do we want this to sound like a burden? Like, what is the relationship um, of this thing to the individual? What is, you know, the larger implication in relation to the films that we programmed? If it sounds like a burden, what happens then? And it feels like that's more how we're interpreting it now, or that's a facet of it, this safety or this idea of home. Would you say that's true, or do you still feel that that's not the implication?
I mean, I think it was always a underlying theme, but I think it was maybe uh, the idea of who's authoring the burden, or the and the agency of who is empowered to construct the narrative. And I think some of the titles that we were considering, it was sort of rooted in the idea of a force placing a burden on the bird. And that didn't really feel, I mean, that felt like, you know, of the perspective maybe empowering too much of, and Lubuga Benson's the historical archival footage, rather than the present day, the revolutions that are happening around, and that voice. And I think in the way that we constructed the title, it becomes this notion of flying with the nest is also a idea of a choice, or that is something that is an empowered move to in the way of Time to Leave, taking that generational or ancestral history with you, as a mode of power, maybe rather than a burden.
Yeah. You have the past, leave us alone.
I like that it can be both.
Mm-hmm.
It's rich in that way. You both are just so brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to say thank you as well, if you can hear me. I had a bad run-in with the dentist today, so I apologize for keeping the camera off. I really enjoyed this program, and now I want to go back to the beginning and see the whole series, the whole arc, because I know I missed something along the way because I missed some programs. So I would be interested in making that commitment and seeing the whole thing. I think that you both drew out some threads of things that I hadn't actually put together in some ways when I watched the program in my distracted situation. So thank you very much. And hi, Taka. I didn't realize you were there until I heard Janelle mention you.
Hi, Kelly.
Hi. Anyway, nice to see you both. And thank you so much for this.
It was great to hear you, Kelly, and thanks for being with us. I hope in some way being present in a virtual new era space helps you heal.
Yeah, no, this is just really interesting. I feel like I just saw the most invigorating lecture in a way, just the way you drew us through. So anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, and I guess, going back to the notion of the human-animal relationship. I mean, I think that's the one thing, the one blessing out of all of the pandemic period has just been being able to spend so much time with my cat, who's sitting in my lap right now. But I think the idea of understanding, hey, there's another cat. And I know, Jenny and Laura, you've had cats roaming around the background of your screen too. Hey, but I think it's the idea of, and I think it's another iteration of the bird sings more than it knows, is I realized the mannerisms of my cat. Like, my cat knows a lot more about me than maybe I even let on. So sometimes, I mean, even when we're on these like Zoom calls, or if I have to do a Zoom meeting, my cat will always be near me or be sitting on my lap. But there are moments when my cat understands like when the meeting is done or when the meeting is reaching its ending point, and that's the moment that he'll either hop off or like claw at me. And I mean, if it's an important meeting, I don't know if it's something through my mannerisms before I hop on the meeting, or if it's the way that I'm speaking, but my cat just stays silent the whole time. And it's really interesting to think about and picking up on that. And I'm sure that's something that my cat knew all along, but it's something that me as a dumb human am just now picking up through observation. So,
Well, I mean, every single aCinema conversation, I've brought up Kanye and Kim or Ursula Le Guin. And in Le Guin's novels, we are referred to as the little brothers and sisters, the ones who need to be taught. So, yeah.
Taka, my cat, does the same thing. I've been super interested, and I feel like it's a film in the making. But they do know when it's time to end, you know.
Yeah. Is Potatoes with you right now, Kelly?
She is, yes, but she's in the doghouse because she sorry, she's a cat, right? But yeah, she brought a bird in the house today, and the bird survived, but that was a thing. You know, she's quarantined, she's a little sick of being cooped up too.
Thank you both so much. Yeah, and thanks everyone. This has been, as always, just incredible. Very grateful.
Thank you, Mike, and thank
Yeah.
you, Woodland Pattern,
Thank
for
you.
hosting us.
Yeah, thank you, Woodland Pattern.
I can't wait till we're in the gallery again.
I know.
And hopefully this too, like maybe we're hybrid so that people can be present in the room and present elsewhere. So
We were just before this began having a conversation about how to bring Taka into the gallery when we
yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, and I also like the idea of opening it up for artists who are in Brazil or elsewhere.
Exactly.
totally.
Yeah.
We tend to curate quite internationally. So I would like to keep that opportunity to bring them present.
We should talk sometime soon and how just like set up a meeting to like figure out how to do things in the fall and other things too.
Absolutely.
Let's enter that new era.
New
and bring it hybrid. DG, hey bud.
It's working. Oh, there it is.
Oh, now it's kind of working.
Hi.
He looks like a Muppet.
Like I do not look like a Muppet. Human.
Be quiet, little sister.
Your cats are all making me giggle, but I'm gonna hop off. But thank you so much. And Janelle and Taka, it would be awesome to catch up soon. I've been writing about effective ecologies, and I feel like we have a conversation to be had sometime soon.
Yes, Kelly, absolutely. I would love that.
Love to see you guys. Bye.
Bye. Have a good night.
And good night, everybody.
Bye. We
Yes,
will get in
indeed.
touch
Yeah.
sometime soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye.